Welcome everyone to our last week, week 10, in which we will talk about Korean diaspora, but particularly Soviet Koreans who themselves call themselves as a Goryeo Saram, and how they enriched the Soviet culinary life with their own food. That's what I will talk about, and my name is Chang-Ju Song. I'm a senior lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. The content that we will cover today is, again, as usual, a very brief history of the Soviet Koreans, or Goryeo Saram, and how and when and why they migrated from the Korean Peninsula to the Russian Far East. And that was mostly after 1860s, and then which changed to Soviet Union in 1922. And their life, and particularly in 1937, their forced relocation suddenly to Central Asia. So that's what we will cover. And then their life after 1992 when Soviet Union collapsed. And also we will cover the original culinary culture that these people brought themselves from northern part of the Korean Peninsula to the Russian Far East. And then when they are relocated to Central Asia, how again their culinary culture became changed. And also the post-Soviet immigration, again back to Russian Far East for some people, and great majority of people returning to their ethnic homeland, South Korea. And that also have a serious impact on their culinary culture. And then how their culinary culture through this, their complicated history of multi-layered history of migration, and how that made their culinary very unique and very interesting. And then one of our main focus today is how this Goryeo Saram actually globalized their food, which is Korean food, in the Soviet Union. Already from 1960s, 70s, 80s, long before today's popularity of K-food started in the rest of the world. And after they returned to South Korea, how they contributed in diversifying South Korean culinary scenes. That's what we will cover. And our goals here today, our audience will have understood a brief migrant history of Goryeo Saram with a focus that when and from where and why they migrated to the Soviet Russian Far East. And then audience would have understood why they were relocated by force under the Stalin's rule in 1937 all the way to Central Asia. And audience would have understood how their culinary practices and culture drastically changed through this series of migrations. First to Russia from Korea, and then from Russian Far East to Central Asia, and then post-Soviet re-migration for coming back to Russian Far East, and also coming back to South Korea. And in this process, how they have contributed in diversifying South Korean culinary culture, but at the same time, the audience would have understood how they have actually globalized Korean food throughout the entire Soviet Union. All right, so we will start the first session under the title Soviet Koreans Migration History. Not many people know about them, as a matter of fact, because currently there are only about 500,000 ethnic Koreans scattered around in Central Asia, which includes Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and also Russia. how they are spread out, these former Soviet republics. And like their Joseon족 co-ethnics in China, Goryeo Saram also came from exactly same place, the northern Hamgyong province. So Goryeo Saram and Joseon족, they share same dialect and exactly same culinary culture. But interestingly, and their migration happened almost at the same time. The only matter is the land that you see in red circle that I made, that is what we call Russian Far East today. And that land, Russians grabbed that land only in 1860 from Qing dynasty. As a matter of fact, as we already talked about it when we were talking about Joseon족 migration history, Manchus who conquered Ming dynasty and established the powerful Qing dynasty, they didn't allow anyone to come in to their homeland, which is Manchuria. However, in the late Qing, 19th century, Qing was challenged by Western powers coming from the west and south. So, to opium wars and many rebellions within Qing territory. And so Manchu leaders were having hard time in 19th century, trying to keep the territorial integrity of Qing, China. Nevertheless, meanwhile, Russians already reached the Pacific Ocean by 18th century, and they started to come down to south. And because Qing was busy trying to defend the southern China from British, French, and so on, so they could not really pay much attention to Russians. And that's why around 1860, Qing dynasty changed its policy by allowing Han Chinese going into their ethnic homeland, which is Manchuria. But Russia managed to carve out this huge territory out of Manchus and made it its own territory. And that happened in 1860. So that's why this part of this huge land, which has a border with Korea, or today North Korea, about 15 miles. 15 miles is about 25 kilometers. So that 25 kilometer block entire Manchuria going to the Pacific Ocean. So even today, the Chinese feel very bad about this historical event because the three provinces in northeast China doesn't have access to sea, to the Sea of Japan or Donghae or East Sea that Koreans call. The only access is from Dalian in Manchuria coming to the West Sea of Korea or Hwanghae or Yellow Sea as it is called. So that really limit Chinese power today. And that happened in 1860. Anyway, Koreans who happened to be left west side of this river Ussuri, that long river, the Ussuri, it flows from north and south. They became Joseon족 because that became Chinese territory. Same people who happened to be east side of Ussuri River, they became Soviet Koreans. So same people from same region, nearly same period, they migrated to that part of Manchuria and they became totally different people and they had totally different migration experiences. And that is why studying about Korean diaspora is very interesting depending on where they landed, their life totally changed. So in this case, that's why this Goryeo Saram, they are living in Russia, which changed to Soviet Union in 1922. And so originally, they brought Hamgyong province culinary culture to this part of Russia. But of course, this is a Russian territory, and Russians were coming in, but very small number. So Vladivostok, which was established in 1860, the great majority of the population in Vladivostok, except the central part of the city, were Koreans. And if anyone knows about Korean history, the famous patriot, the An Jung-gun, who assassinated Ito Hirobumi, the Japanese prime minister, and Prince Ito Hirobumi in Harbin Station in 1909. Actually, An Jung-gun came from Vladivostok, because Vladivostok was the center of Korean culture outside of Korea. There was a newspaper, there were even many schools, and so on and so on. Okay? But anyway, so Vladivostok itself, there were a lot of Koreans. Koreans were the majority for a while. Anyway, so Koreans were living there. But Russian Revolution happened in 1917 in the European part of Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this revolution spread to the east, and the entire country of Russia became Soviet Union. Now that is 1922. And 15 years later, the famous, notorious dictator Stalin captured all Koreans in the Russian Far East and forced them to be relocated to all the way to Central Asia, which is more than 6,000 kilometers away. It's a totally different climate. So suddenly these poor Koreans, and one day in late autumn in 1937, they had to migrate to Central Asia. But anyway, this is late 19th century depiction of Far East, Russian Far East, and you see the Russian settlers, that's their house. And then there were also the Korean settlers. So Far East was a very empty land, just like Manchuria itself, and both Koreans, and there were some Chinese, and maybe small number of Manchus as well, and then Russians, they all lived together. And some of these photos shows the life of Koreans there. You see these Koreans together sitting, taking a photo together with a Russian Orthodox father, the clergy man, the clergy, like a Catholic father. And these Koreans became Orthodox Christian. I believe that was maybe for the First World War. The Koreans were in the Far East were also conscripted for the Russian Empire, and they were sent to the front line in Europe. This life changed in 1937 when Stalin or Soviet Union was facing powerful enemy in the West, Germany. Germany was rising after the First World War, and now it was very clear in the mind of Stalin that even though there was a treaty between Soviet Union and Germany, the Hitler's Germany, he knew that, he believed Germany would invade Russia. So Soviet Union had to defend itself in the west frontier. And eastern frontier, there's another enemy, which is Japan. And Stalin did not want to have a war with Japan. Anyway, this eastern part, this is Siberia, there are a small number of Russians, but Western Soviet Union, which has big cities like Moscow and so on, that's way, way more important. So he wanted to fight only Germany at the time. But this presence of these Koreans in the Russian Far East was problematic. First of all, there might be some spies that work for Japan. And for Russians, they can't distinguish who are Koreans, who are Japanese. And bigger problem is these Koreans, like An Jung-gun earlier in 1909, they can provoke Japan and give Japan very good excuse to invade. And that's why Stalin wanted to get rid of them. And that's why this sudden relocation happened. This relocation is extremely tragic one because more than 10% of entire Korean population perished during just a bit while moving from Russian Far East to Central Asia because of the harsh conditions. Late autumn is already very cold in Siberia, and it took more than a month usually getting from Vladivostok all the way to Central Asia. So there is a documentary about it. And these Koreans were named as unreliable people or enemy nation formally by the Soviet Union. So these Koreans were not innocent in a sense from the Soviet Union perspective. So they are enemies, and that's why they were relocated all the way there. And so anyway, we will continue to talk about their life in Central Asia, but there is another group of people, the Koreans, who are totally different from this group, which became Goryeo Saram later. Now, this another group is Sakhalin Koreans. Sakhalin is an island here in this map. The far right, you see Japan, the Hokkaido, and then there's a long island. Now that is Sin Long Island. That is Sakhalin. And half of the Sakhalin was Japanese territory at that time because of the Russo-Japanese War that happened in 1905. Anyway, so during the colonial period, Sakhalin became very important because Sakhalin has so much natural resources, coal, even oil, and timber, and so on and so on. So Sakhalin needed a lot of people to work. So, and also the wage was higher in Sakhalin than in Japan itself because it's a far remote area. So naturally, many poor migrant workers went there, both Japanese and Koreans, and that's why they settled. And of course, near the end of the war, now Japanese government forced some Koreans to go all the way to Sakhalin to work. And that's why they were there. But when the Second World War ended, Soviet troops came to southern Sakhalin, and Japanese all left the island, but Koreans remained. They didn't take Koreans. They didn't have enough boat and so on. So, and Soviets who arrived in the southern Sakhalin, they also needed these Koreans to develop the island continuously because in the Far East, the population of Russia very, very small, even today. And that's why these Koreans were not allowed to leave the land, the island, and they had to live there. And they became so-called Sakhalin Koreans. Now, these Sakhalin Koreans are not from northern part of the Korean peninsula. They are mostly from southern provinces of Korea, including Gyeongsang-do and some Jeollado, and some even Jeju Island. But anyway, in 1945, there were about 40,000 Koreans were living there. So they formed both this Goryeo Saram, who had migrated from Korean peninsula to the Russian Far East after 1860s, as well as this small number of Koreans who were captured by the Soviet troops at the end of the Second World War, they all became so-called Soviet Koreans. However, these Koreans who came much earlier, not in Sakhalin, much earlier to Russian Far East, they are called Goryeo Saram. So please, let's distinguish them. And because not many people really know about Sakhalin Koreans, now this photo was taken in sometime, I believe, 1940, after the Soviet occupation of Sakhalin, maybe late 1940s. And now this is a classroom in a small city which was called Boronai. That's in central part of Sakhalin. And in classroom, you see Stalin's photo at the center. And on the left, in Korean, it says, Comrade Lenin said, let's learn and learn more and learn more. And then on your right here, it says, this reflects very Japanese. It says, our school's motto. And it says, what? Patience, hard work, and never giving up. Okay? So very interesting. Now this symbolically shows what the culture of Sakhalin people, including their culinary culture. Sakhalin Koreans' culinary culture, as we will see, it has a multi-layers, like a Korean and Japanese and Russian. And on the contrary, the continental Koreans, the Goryeo Saram culinary culture has Korean, Russian, Central Asian. So that's why their culinary culture is very interesting. And now we will talk about what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in our second session.